Howdy, partner. It's day 3 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers, and this set keeps getting more and more ridiculous. Let's break down some ridiculously powerful new cards. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers. And like I said in the intro, this set's ridiculous. There's so many more super pushed, really exciting new cards today. Some of the best Grizzly Bears we've ever seen, some really spicy mythic, some super playable stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Outlaws of Thunder Junction cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Yeah! First up today, we got a new Geralf in Geralf the Fleshwright, and this card is wild. This set is wild, my god. It's a 3-mana 2/3 legendary human warlock. It says when you cast a spell during your turn, other than the first spell that turn, you create a 2/2 black zombie rogue creature token, and whenever a zombie ETBs under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So how this works in practice, you play Geralf, then you probably untap the next turn. Your first spell does nothing. Your second spell makes a 2/2 zombie. Your third spell makes a 3/3 zombie. Your fourth spell makes a 4/4 zombie, and it just keeps snowballing from there, which is kind of ridiculous. So this is like a zombie storm card, essentially, or it can be a zombie storm card. It does so much more than that. Also worth pointing out, this card is not restricted in any way. There's no once per turn or anything like that, and it's not even restricted by what type of spell you cast. Often we see like Ultic Matter Weaver. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you do a thing. Poppet Stitcher. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you do a thing. Actually, Geralf makes Poppet Stitcher look so janky. Like Poppet Stitcher making decay zombies that can't even like do things really. Just like so bad compared to Geralf making real zombies. So this card is kind of blowing my mind, actually, that there's just not more restrictions on this. So how do you use this card? Well, what I'm going to do with this card first is Necroduality zombies. Oh my goodness, Necroduality is not rotated yet. We still have like 3 or 4 months that we can put these cards together. I love Necroduality. I love zombies, like all together, and Geralf is just so incredibly perfect for this deck because Necroduality, every zombie we make is going to give us a second zombie, and this leads to some turns where we have like 10 or 20 zombies entering the battlefield. Once you get like Headless Rider going and sack outlets and exploit stuff, and every zombie we make is going to get so many counters thanks to Geralf that our team is just going to get out of control super quickly. So definitely jamming this in Vadmir Necroduality zombies in Standard. That is a deck to look out for. We're going to be playing that very soon. There's also infinite combos like the Gravecrawler loops. You have Gravecrawler and a zombie and something like Phyrexian Altar. You can sack the Gravecrawler, cast it from your graveyard for free essentially because you can use the Phyrexian Altar mana. So you can do this as many times as you want. Each time you do it, you're going to be making a zombie. Each of those zombies is going to get bigger thanks to the second ability. So essentially with this loop, you make an infinite number of increasingly and eventually infinitely big zombies to win the game. Also seems really good with Gisa the Hellraiser in Standard. It's kind of awkward that both of these cards are warlocks, so they don't work directly with zombie synergies, but they both make a lot of zombies. So I think you could build some sort of zombie crime token mid-range deck out of these cards where you got Gisa and you crime and you make 2 zombies and then you Geralf to get more counters on them and they just get really big. So also interested in trying a deck like that. Also works really well with mass reanimation. Like if you can just reanimate a whole bunch of zombies at once with a living end or something, you're just going to get a huge board of creatures. And then there's also just like the storm potential. So this is kind of like janky, right? I don't think you're actually going to like play Legacy Storm and drop, you know, your other payoffs for Geralf, but it does kind of work that way. If you can get Geralf down and just cast a bunch of spells, you're going to make a ton of zombies. Those zombies are going to get really big. You're going to win the game. So all around Geralf is a wild card to me. Like this card is really strong. I know. We were kind of burnt by Poppet Stitcher, but it turns out decay zombies did kind of suck, which is what we kind of thought during spoiler season, and it ended up being true that decay zombies just aren't very good. The fact that this makes real zombies, they don't even come to play tapped, and it has all these other upsides, and it's just a 3-drop. This card is so insane. So definitely expect this to be a build around. I think it's going to be a really popular card. It seems like a really playable card. Zombies just might be back because of Geralf. We also got probably my favorite new commander from the set, in Kambal Sternmare. So Kambal, 3-mana Orzhov, 2/4 legendary human advisor, says whenever one or more tokens ETB under an opponent's control, create a tap copy of each of them, but only once each turn. And then whenever one or more tokens ETB under your control, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So obviously the abilities kind of work with each other. Like if you have Kambal down and your opponent makes a wedding announcement token, you'll get a tapped wedding announcement token, and you'll drain your opponent for 1 from that token entering the battlefield under your control. But you can also just build around it and make your own tokens. So this card, we've never really seen a ton of cards that punish your opponent's tokens. The only one I can really think of is Crafty Cuppers, which you flash in and you like steal all the tokens your opponent would make that turn, you get them instead. Kambal, it's not going to get your opponent the way Crafty Cuppers does, but it's a static effect that's just going to sit out there and apply every single turn as your opponent's making tokens. And it also is worth mentioning, this doesn't say creature token. So if you have this out and your opponent docksides, you're going to get a tap copy of all the treasures. Your opponent makes a clue or a blood, whatever. It works on all these trinkety non-creature tokens as well, which makes this card really, really wild. So just think about current standard. A lot of things make tokens, especially when you start adding clues and maps and bloods into the mix. These are just some of the most played cards in standard, but like Preacher of the Schism, gonna make a 1/1 vampire with lifelink. Novice Inspector, Spyglass Siren make trinket tokens, wedding announcements, making tokens, Wandering Emperors, Gleeful Demolition makes 3 tokens, Sanguine Evangelist. So there's gonna be a lot of decks where this is gonna do something. So obviously your opponent's gonna see it sitting out on the battlefield, so they're probably not gonna take and like cast their Secure the Waste into your Kambal, because they're gonna know it's gonna go pretty poorly. On the other hand, a lot of these effects, your opponent can't really play their deck without playing them. It's not like you can not play your wedding announcement because Kambal's gonna come out or could come out. Plus, wedding announcement's gonna keep working. Are you gonna not attack with your Preacher of the Schism ever because your opponent is gonna make a 1/1? So your opponent's gonna have to play into a lot of these effects. And then you get this like pseudo wayward servant effect essentially when tokens ETB under your control. And this effect is interesting. So it's worth mentioning here that no matter how many tokens ETB under your control, you're only going to drain once. So it means Kambal works better with recurring token production that makes a small number of tokens rather than these big X token spells. So like if you Secure the Waste for 100, you drain for 1, but if you can stack up a Bitter Blossom and a Skrelv Scythe, each of those tokens ETBing individually is going to drain your opponent again and again and again, which I think is another way to take advantage of this. All the cards we were just talking about your opponent playing, Novice Inspectors and Sanguine Evangelists and Wedding Announcements and Preacher of the Schisms and Wandering Emperors, those are all cards that you can play, and there's no once per turn restriction on that last ability. So your Novice Inspector makes a clue token, drains your opponent for 1. Your Sanguine Evangelist makes a bat token, drains for 1. Your Wedding Announcement makes a 1/1, that drains for 1. So that's actually going to add up to a lot of damage in a deck build around it. There's also some ways to go all in on this. Like imagine playing Kambal in an Oni called Anvil deck where you're playing Novice Inspectors in Voldaren Epicures to make bloods and clues that you sack to the anvil, to make constructs that then you sack to drain your opponent to your Kambal, and you burn your opponent with Oni called Anvil. So I could certainly see some like token drain machine deck emerging out of this. But why I'm excited about this is the literal best Dagger Burn commander and one of the best Dagger Burn cards of all time. So we have Hunted Bone Brute in standard. Hunted Bone Brute, when it ETBs, your opponent makes 2/1 white dog creature tokens. But if you have Kambal out, your opponent's going to make those tokens, but then it'll trigger Kambal, so you'll also make tap versions of those tokens, and you'll drain your opponent because those tokens enter the battlefield. And you might remember a while ago, one of my all-time favorite decks was Dagger Burn, and the idea of this deck was to kill your opponent by giving them tokens. That's why it's Dagger Burn, because Dousing Dagger gives your opponent the plants. Kambal is like designed to support this archetype. So you just stack up your like Trespasser's Curse and Kambals, you give your opponents tokens, maybe you have a Panharmonicon to double up the triggers, and you burn your opponent out of the game. You can play the hunted cards like Hunted Phantasm to give your opponent tons of tokens. Kambal is designed to make this strategy work. Not only is it another way to burn your opponent as your tokens are coming into play, but it really solves one of the downsides of the deck. One of the biggest problems with Dagger Burn is it's an inherently risky strategy because you're giving your opponent creatures, and sometimes you give your opponent a bunch of creatures and they kill you with them. But if you have Kambal out when you Haunted Phantasm and give your opponent 5/1/1s, you also will get 5/1/1s, which you can use to block your opponent's 1/1s. So it really solves the biggest issue in the Dagger Burn archetype. So we're definitely gonna have to rebuild Dagger Burn for, like, I don't know, Timeless or Historic or Pioneer Modern or something. But it's also like the perfect Dagger Burn commander. So Kambal, absolutely love this card. One of my favorite designs from the set. It punishes things that should be punished, which is token production, which is rampant in Magic these days. Plus, it's a really cool build around. Plus, you can play it in a token deck. Plus, Dagger Burn's a thing, and I just absolutely love this card. Favorite card of the set so far. However, we got another card in the set that might even be more of my favorite card from the set so far. This set's just so good. Another round. So another round, 3 mana in double X. It's a white sorcery. It says exile any number of target creatures you control, then return those creatures to the battlefield under their owner's control. Repeat this process X times. So what this kind of essentially says is trigger all your ETB stuff that number of times. So for 3 mana, you can exile up to your whole board of creatures, put them back into play. For 5 mana, you exile those creatures, they come back into play, then you exile them again, they come back into play. So you get all your ETB stuff twice, 7 mana 3 times, 9 mana 4 times. It kind of scales like Doppelgang in this way, and this card can do some absurd things. The only thing we've seen that's kind of like this is high rolling with Lae'zel's Acrobatics. If you high roll with Lae'zel's Acrobatics, you get to exile your creatures, put them back into play, then exile your creatures, and they come back into play on your end step. Another round is going to give you the possibility of doing this 3, 4, 5, 6 times and probably just winning the game when it resolves. So level 1, great Panharmonicon style card, right? You got your Elish Norn out, and then you take in, you blink all your Spirited Companions, and Charming Princess, all your ETB stuff once or twice or 3 times to just get all the ETB triggers a whole bunch of times. Obviously, instead of card draw, you could put in stuff that like burns your opponent and actually kill them, but it's probably more fun just to draw the cards. Also hilarious with like Avalanche Riders or ETB Acidic Slimes, things that ETB blow up lands with a Panharmonicon out. You can make it really, really mean if you want to. It also seems sweet with ramp stuff, so you can like play your Topiary Stompers or Wood Elves or Solemns, do a bunch of ramping, because another round, if you want that double X to get high and to do it a bunch of times, you do need a lot of mana, but you can take in, do a bunch of ramping, blink all your ramp stuff to make even more mana, and then your next another round will be even bigger. I'm actually kind of surprised this card doesn't exile itself after it resolves, because there's some pretty easy loops for this card. Like, for example, you get a Dockside Extortionist and an Eternal Witness, you blink all your stuff, Dockside makes a ton of mana, Eternal Witness gets back another round, and then you go another round and you do it again. Dockside makes a bunch more mana that you can use to cast another round. Eternal Witness gets back another round, and you do it again. So it just keeps happening. So it's pretty easy to go infinite. And if you don't like Dockside or whatever, you can do the same thing with like Burning Tree Emissaries, other treasure producers like Wily Goblin, Emrakul Hatcher. Like, all you really need to loop this is an Eternal Witness in a way to make at least 3 mana with things entering the battlefield between Scion tokens, treasure tokens, Burning Tree Emissary effects, and if you're making even more mana, then you're going to get even more ETB value out of it. So that's already really wild. Plus, you can actually just kill people if you want to. I don't know why you'd want to kill people when you could just blink Spirited Companions and Muldrifters all day, but if you have a War Leader's Call or an Impact Tremors or a Perforos God of the Forge, something that triggers to deal damage whenever a creature ETBs, just blinking your whole board 2 or 3 times is probably just going to fully burn your opponent out of the game. People have also mentioned it's kind of cute with Will's Scion of Peace, just because Will can make so much mana. So you could build some sort of life gain deck and use Will to like pay another round's X cost and cast it, I don't know, like X10 or something. I don't know what you're blinking in a Will shell, but it is a way you can really power up another round. The other place this is, I think, just a new staple, is in any Blink or Panharmonicon style commander deck. So I will say, the one thing another round is bad at is saving your creatures. This is not a protection spell. We've seen in the past like Eerie Interlude or whatever. You can use it to blink out your team, even Lae'zel's Acrobatics. You can use it to blink out your team to avoid a Wrath or fizzle a targeted removal spell. Another round's not going to do that. Because it's a sorcery and because the creatures come into play right away, there's not really a way you can use this to protect your team. So this is more of like a combo piece, something to support your game plan. But if you're playing Preston the Vanisher, my goodness, is this going to pop off? Or Brago, or Realm, or even just a Panharmonicon deck like Emil. Another round is such an easy inclusion. You just make a bunch of mana ramp into it and blink your board a bunch of times, and probably either win the game, or at least just like pull so ridiculously far ahead with all your ETB value that it's going to be hard for anyone to get back into the game. So another round, this is another card that's kind of just like wild that it exists. Like, it blows my mind. Not that it's going to break competitive 60 card play or anything like that. Sure, there could be a combo deck around it. I do think it has potential in those combo shells, so maybe someone can break it in 60 card formats, but this is just one of the biggest, flashiest effects. It's going to lead to some of the most ridiculous board states and hugest turns that we've ever seen, and I absolutely love it. We get a new Simic legend, and this one is pretty Simic. Bonny, Pall, Clearcutter, which is essentially the Magic version of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Big Blue Locks. It's a 6 mana 6/5 legendary giant scout. It has sneaky reach. When it ETBs, you create Bo, a legendary blue ox creature token. With this creature's power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control, and then when you attack, you draw a card and you put a land from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield. So Bonny, Pall, Clearcutter, this card's kind of ridiculous, right? When I first read it, I was like, okay, this is exactly the kind of Simic commander I hate, and it still is, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but this card is actually kind of ridiculous in what it does. If you think about this card, this is a 6-drop that essentially creates a 7-drop Malamo Marrow Sorcerer. I guess it doesn't have Trample, the Ox token, but still, this is a 6-drop that's creating essentially another like 5, 6, 7 mana creature. Like, a creature with power and toughness equal to number of lands you control is huge. Assuming you just ramp into this with lands, you're gonna get a 6 mana 6/5 that makes at least a 6/6 to come alongside it. That is an absurd amount of power and toughness for 6 mana. And then you get this upside of whenever you attack, you do like a better growth spiral. The first thing I thought of is this is like a very upgraded version of a Motto Worm. If you remember a Motto Worm with some of the most questionable art in the history of Magic, but if you remember a Motto Worm, it was pretty good a decade ago, back in its time in Return to Ravnica standard, is just a 6 mana 5/5 with trample that made another 5/5. This is like such a hugely upgraded version. Yeah, you're losing trample, which is an annoyance, but still the creatures it makes is so big, and it generates card advantage, and it's able to ramp you as well. So I think Bonny, Pall, Clearcutter, as I mentioned, you get huge creatures, you get a better growth spiral because you can put the land into play from the graveyard. The attack trigger, just so this is clear, it works when you attack with anything, but it doesn't matter how much stuff you attack with. If you attack with 10 things, it's still just a single trigger. But this means you can play Bonny, Pall and then attack with another creature the same turn and immediately get that trigger the turn it came into play. So as long as you have something that can attack, you should at least get to draw one card and ramp once with Bonny, Pall, Clearcutter. So this card, I think, it lines up really poorly with Wrath, which is a concern. We are in a standard that has really, really strong Wraths that see a lot of play. So if your opponent's playing Sunfall or now Final Showdown, Bonny Pall's not going to do a ton, right? You just like make all this power across multiple bodies, but then your opponent just sweeps it all away. On the other hand, it lines up really well with targeted removal. If your opponent's on the Go for the Throat plan or our new Go for the Throat Shoot the Sheriff plan, then Bonny Pall is actually a really effective card because you're going to get 2 bodies out of it. So even if your opponent can kill one of them, probably the Bonny Pall, you're still going to have this massive Ox left over to generate value. So I think this card could actually see play in standard. Like, we already have decks that are built on ramping and are in these colors. I could imagine this filling in the like Topiary Stomper, Atraxa Tallies type decks, where this just comes down a turn earlier than Atraxa Tally. It gums up the board, it generates card advantage, it ramps you, and then you still play your big finisher. So probably not a 4 of, but I could certainly see a copy or 2 of this showing up in ramp decks. It also seems interesting in the Aftermath Analysis decks. If you've ever seen these decks pop off, they make so many lands, because the whole idea is you just like self-mill, and then you Aftermath Analyst, and then you Splendid Reclamation, and eventually have like 20 lands on the battlefield. In a deck like that, Bonny Pall is going to make a absolutely ridiculously massive Ox, so I could see playing a couple of copies there as well. The place that I hate this card, and I gotta do this little rant, my god, do I hate this style of Simic commander. And I know if you look at color combinations, they all have like some sort of gimmick that WotC goes to way too much, like Boros Equipment, Rakdos Sacrifice. Simic gets these like growth spiral ramp type commanders, and they are honestly my least favorite commanders in all of the format. The problem I have with these Simic Growth Spiral style commanders is if you think a commander, the literal best things you can do in the format are ramp and draw cards, and like Asai and Teyova and now Bonny Pall, they just do all that with your commander, while also adding, in this case, a ridiculous amount of power to the battlefield. So I really wish Wizards would stop printing these like card advantage / ramp engine commanders in Simic. Like, let them do something else. Like, you don't have to do this every set or every year. We don't need a new one of these just like generic Simic good stuff commanders. That said, the card's super powerful, and based on the popularity of commanders like Asai and Teyova, these also like ramp card advantage engine commanders, I imagine that Bonny Pall is going to be a pretty popular option in Commander, and that doesn't even include the flavor, where some people just love the idea of playing Paul Bunyan and Babe the Big Blue Ox. So Bonny Pall, I think this card's actually pretty good. I think it's got a shot in Standard, just based on the immense amount of power adds to the battlefield for 6 mana, alongside a couple of pretty powerful card advantage triggers. So I think that has a chance in Standard. In worst case, it's going to be a really popular commander. We also got 3 steps ahead, and this card, I think, is very intriguing to me. So this is another spree card, a mono blue spree card. So it's 1 blue mana plus 1 and a blue to counter target spell, plus 3 generic to create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, or plus 2 generic to draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. So if we look at what this card is, essentially, its base is a cancel, and this is probably the best cancel of all time, just 3 mana blue counter spell. So its base level is that. So it's a 3 mana counter spell, which isn't exciting, but when you consider all the flexibility and like the charm aspect of this card, then it becomes a little more intriguing. It's also kind of a crackling counterpart. It is 1 more mana, but you can copy artifacts, and then you can also just catalog, plus you have the option to kind of like build your own Sublime Epiphany, and if you have a ridiculous amount of mana, you can dump it all into this card and counter something and copy something and do some drawing and discarding along the way. So is this card actually good? And I think the question is cancel good enough, even with all these upsides? And I think the answer is yes, but maybe not in every deck. So right now in Standard, we have Make Disappear and No More Lies. Those are kind of the 2 key counter spells in the format. And if you're playing a generic control deck, I don't think you're like cutting these cards for 3 steps ahead. I think that 3 steps ahead is additive, if that makes sense. I think you still play the No More Lies and Make Disappears, and then maybe you play a couple copies of 3 steps ahead on top of those cards. Is just this like, yeah, it's a little bit expensive as a counter, but you have all these other flexible options type of counter spell. I think it goes up in value in creature decks. The other problem with control is you're probably not going to have anything good to copy with this second mode, the 4 mana create a token that's a copy of an artifact or creature you control mode. But if you're playing like a Dimir deck or an Esper deck, or the other thing I thought is like Venerated Rot Priest Bant, this is like a slightly expensive counter, but it's also another way you can target and copy your Rot Priest, which seems pretty good. So in a deck like that, I think this goes up even more in value because you're more likely to be able to take advantage of these other modes. It also seems interesting in like Reenact the Crime style decks where you have another looting effect. It gives you a counter spell that you can sneak into your deck that doesn't do nothing if you don't need a counter spell. Plus being able to copy like an Atraxa or an Atali, even though you legend rule yourself, their ETB triggers are so incredibly strong that being able to do that in instant speed is actually a really, really powerful effect. So I think there's certainly homes for 3 steps ahead, and this is very likely the best cancel of all time. I don't think anything else really competes with it. The issue is cancel's just not a very good card, so I'm still not sure this is like a true staple. On the other hand, look at Archmage's Charm. That sees a lot of play in Modern, and that has like some similar modes, right? It's a 3 mana counter, which is certainly too expensive for Modern, but you also get this draw 2 card mode, which 3 steps ahead kind of has. So I think this is like standard Archmage's Charm. I don't know. I think the card's really good. I'm just not sure if it's going to be a 4 of in control decks. I think you got to be the creature decks to really take full advantage of it, but don't sleep on this card. The flexibility is off the charts, and it's definitely going to see a lot of play. Speaking of spree cards that are really flexible and going to see a lot of play, we also got Smuggler Surprise, and this card might just be straight up busted. I was actually kind of shocked that this is an instant. So Smuggler Surprise, 1 green mana plus 2 generic to mill 4 cards, and then you put 2 creatures and your land cards from the milled cards into your hand, or plus 5 mana, including a green, to put 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield, or plus 1 creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible in the end of turn. This card is absolutely absurd, and I think this card might actually be busted all the way back through Modern at a minimum. Maybe it even goes further back than that. So the easy comparison here is this is like a Tooth and Nail effect, right? Tooth and Nail, it's 1,000,000 mana, but if you get enough mana, you can search your library for 2 creatures and then put them in your hand and then put the creatures into play from your hand. For 7 mana, you can just do kind of the put 2 creatures into play from your hand mode. So this is like an upgraded version of Tooth and Nail. Yes, there is more risk here. You don't get the full tutor mode, but you can like mill yourselves to try to find creatures and then put them into play. But really, it doesn't even matter. This is an instant and it costs less mana than Tooth and Nail. And Tooth and Nail's already close to being a playable card. It wasn't that long ago that Tooth and Nail was a playable card in Modern. So I think this card, if you look at what it does, it's essentially Druidic Ritual, but at instant speed. So already upgraded, and you get to mill an extra card, but it's a 3 mana, most likely draw 2 in green at instant speed. Then you get the Tooth and Nail, put creatures into play mode, and then you get a twist on Heroic Intervention. It doesn't save all your small creatures, but it's Heroic Intervention for your big creatures. When you add all this together, you have a ridiculous card, just an absolutely ridiculous card. So in Standard, obviously, the dream's going to be that you slam your Atraxa or a Tally, actually both of them, into play for free. And there's going to be times when this happens. We already have decks that are playing both of these cards, so there's a lot of decks built around these big creatures that are essentially graveyard decks. You're trying to get them in the graveyard in like Squirming Emergence or Cruelty of Gex or Reenact the Crime. I love Smuggler's Surprise in these decks. It's like so perfect for any deck like this, because the first mode fills your graveyard, so you can set up your Squirming Emergence or Reenact the Crime or Cruelty of Gex, whatever you're trying to do. So that's a nice support piece. And then the second mode of dumping creatures into play from your hand gives you a really, really good backup plan. The problem with Squirming Emergence or Cruelty of Gex or Reenact the Crime is all these strategies, while very powerful, are also very soft to graveyard hate. Smuggler Surprise is a way you can still get your whatever, Atraxa, Tally, Conspiracy Unraveler into play if your opponent locks down your graveyard. So I think in Standard, that's the most obvious home for this card. Once you get back to older formats, this is kind of like a Tooth and Nail. We've seen like Green Devotion decks play Tooth and Nail, and this is probably just an upgraded version because it's cheaper. So we could certainly see a deck like in Pioneer or in Explorer or maybe in Historic that's going to play Smuggler Surprise as a way to just cheat these big things into play. Once you get back into Modern, this is kind of like another Through the Breach. So Through the Breach, obviously, for 5 mana, cheats a creature into play for 1 turn with haste. Smuggler Surprise, for 6 mana, puts a creature into play, does not get haste, actually get 2 creatures potentially, but those creatures stick around forever. So essentially you're paying 1 more mana and losing haste, so it's going to be slower, but the trick here is Smuggler Surprise is still an instant, right? So if you want to get the haste effect, you just wait till your opponent's end step and then put the creatures into play. Then you untap and your Emrakul or Archon of Cruelty or Primeval Titan or whatever is not going to be summoning sick. I've also seen some players mention that this is a really good way to get around subtlety if you're playing like a Primeval Titan deck, like Amulet Titan in Modern. One of the issues is, even if you have the Cavern of Souls and all the protection, your opponent can always just subtlety your Primeval Titan. This is a way that you can put your Primeval Titan into play and not have to worry about subtlety, which is a pretty reasonable upside. Also, kind of funny what you can do with this in combat. This is probably more like meme mode, but can you imagine like your opponent goes to attack you and you use the second mode to just like drop a Phyrexian Obliterator into play at instant speed and block your opponent's big thing and make them sacrifice all their board? There's so many shenanigans for this card. Once you get back to Commander, I think this card's just good in essentially, at a minimum, any deck that has big creatures. So if you're doing like Ur-Dragons or Gishaths, or it fills your graveyard for Madrotha, anything that's just ramping into huge things, this is a really reasonable option. It's a 3-mana draw 2, most likely, that also can just cheat your big things into play. The other part of this card that we've kind of overlooked is it's also almost Heroic Intervention. So it does depend on your deck, right? It only makes your big creatures with power 4 or greater survive, but 4 creatures with power 4 or greater, Smuggler Surprise is Heroic Intervention. And if you look on like EDH Rec, at the most played green cards in Commander, the most played green cards are like 5 or 6 ramp spells, and then the first non-ramp spell is Heroic Intervention. Heroic Intervention is a true Commander staple, because no one likes getting their board wrathed away, and Smuggler Surprise kind of does a big chunk of that. I don't think it replaces Heroic Intervention because it doesn't save your other permanents and it doesn't save your small creatures, but it's a really strong option to have. So you get this upside, right, where you have this card in your deck because it's going to cheat something huge into play and it's going to draw you cards, but you're also going to have this surprise protection spell. So all around, Smuggler's Surprise It's a really ridiculous card. I think this card sees play from standard back through modern at a minimum, maybe even back to legacy, and it's going to be a commander staple thanks to its heroic intervention plus creature cheating mode. So this card is like, it's kind of stunning, like especially as an instant. If it was a sorcery, this card would still be very good, but not as ridiculous. But as an instant, I think this is just one of the most devastatingly strong cards in the entire set. We also got a card that I'm not nearly as hyped about, an Outcaster Trailblazer. So 3 mana 4/2, Human Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you make 1 mana of any color, and whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you can draw a card and you can plot it for 3. So Outcaster Trailblazer, it's kind of a Garruk's Uprising, but on a creature, which I think is a lot worse than being a Garruk's Uprising on an enchantment, because creatures die a lot more, and it doesn't have as much good extra text, like giving trample or potentially drawing one at ETBs. I don't really see the use of this card, honestly. My big concern is it trades down too much. This is a 3-drop that's going to often trade down with a 2-drop of your opponents, which I think means this card probably just doesn't see any play. So I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's some like shenanigans. The extra mana it makes is intriguing, right? If you can store up a few of these with plot, you can kind of set up this big combo turn, but the plot cost is still 3 mana. If it was like 1 mana to plot or something, and then you could like kind of Elvish Spirit Guide it the next turn, something like that, I could see these uses for some sort of like combo plan. But with a 3 mana plot cost and as a 4/2, I think this is one of the weaker cards that we've seen from the set, honestly. Next up, we get to a huge run of some of the most absurd Grizzly Bears of all time. So if you don't know a Grizzly Bear, a 2 mana 2/2, it's a Grizzly Bear. And we have, I think, 4 of them today that all have an absurd amount of upside. So I think the weakest of the bunch is actually Vadmir Newblood. So it's a 2 mana 2/2 legendary vampire rogue. Whenever you commit a crime, you put a +1/+1 counter on it only once each turn. And then if it has 4 more counters on it, it has menace and lifelink. Vadmir, I don't think it's a bad card, right? I believe that committing a crime is almost trivial in Magic. Like, just by playing a normal game of Magic, you're going to often be committing crimes, which is kind of awkward that that's how it works out flavor-wise, but you're cut down something, you go for the throw something, you duress something, you're going to be committing a crime. It's going to happen all the time. It's super easy to commit crimes. The question is, does Vadmir scale fast enough? So if you play this on turn 2, it's going to be a 2/2 until your next turn, because you're not going to have mana to commit a crime. So then on turn 3, you can commit a crime and it becomes a 3/3. The dream scenario is you use the rest of your mana to commit a crime on your opponent's turn and it gets to a 4/4, and then turn 4 could be a 5/5, maybe a 6/6 if you keep criming. Does this scale fast enough to be worth it? I think the answer is probably no. We are just in a really big standard and there's a lot of options. Even if you just stick to vampires and go by the creature type, I think this is definitely worse than Bloodtide Harvester and maybe worse than Vron as well. And if you expand it out to like all black decks, then you got to beat out Deep Cavern Bat, Tenacious Underdog, stuff like Jadar, Cruel Somnophage, which are good in specific decks. So all this to say, I think that Vadmir is an okay card and it does have the potential to snowball, and it will snowball easily because committing a crime is so easy in Magic, but I'm just not sure it's better than the other options. So for me, this is a like, let's wait and see after rotation. Maybe after rotation when there's no Bloodtithe Harvester anymore, maybe this looks a little bit better. For now, I think its best case is maybe like it's a 1-of or something since it's legendary, but I don't think this is going to be super pushed right away. On the other hand, we got a mythic Grizzly Bear in Bristly, Bill, Spine, Sower. The Cactus people have finally arrived. 2 mana 2/2. It has landfall. Whenever a land ETB is under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and then pay 4 to double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. This is a really sweet card. So this is essentially Vinelash Kazandu, but very upgraded for 2024. So when you play a land, you get to put a counter on any creature, not just Vinelash Kazandu, which kind of makes it more like Roaring Earth, but on a creature, which makes it better, because Roaring Earth's big problem is it's not a creature itself. So if you don't have another creature, it doesn't do anything. And then for 5 mana, you essentially get Colonian Hydra's attack trigger to double the counters on each creature you control, which can go incredibly wild. And the thing about Bristly Bill, it doesn't need to attack. All you need is 5 mana, and you can do this at any time. There's no once per turn restrictions or anything. It is a ridiculous card. So this one, Also scales kind of slowly, right? If you're going to play this on turn 2, you've already had to play your land, so your first trigger is going to come on turn 3, but there's so many synergies for this card. Remember, we're in a standard that already has a bunch of +1/+1 counter stuff. Quirion Beastcaller, we have modified mechanics, we got Botanical Brawlers, we got Ocelus, we got Agatha's Soul Cauldron, so there's a bunch of different archetypes where just being able to like put counters on your creatures has a ton of value. And then in the late game, Bristly Bill kind of turns into a finisher when you double up all the counters. Also seems kind of wild, and this is, I think, the second time we've talked about this deck today, so I don't know if you can find room for all these cards, but we've certainly seen Aftermath Analyst, Splendid Reclamation decks be able to have a lot of lands enter the battlefield in a turn. Like, those decks can very easily generate like 10 plus landfall triggers, and honestly even more than that. In the combo turn, it can be generating like 30 or 40 landfall triggers because you loop these cards multiple times. In a deck like that, Bristly Bill becomes kind of ridiculous. If you have a trampling creature like a Slogger to put the counters on, this is just going to make your creature lethally big, one-shot kill your opponent as you go through the combo turn. So it seems really sweet in some sort of landfall combo deck as well. Once you get back to Commander, you could play this as your Commander, and I think it would be kind of fun as your Commander, but I think its most obvious home is in the 99 of any sort of +1/+1 counter decks. Because remember, it's a green card, and in green, you're going to have all this land ramp just by default. You're going to be playing Nature's Lures and Cultivates and all these effects, so it's very easy to be triggering landfall multiple times in a turn in a green Commander deck. So this is going to pop off in like Shalayan Halar, Sovereign Onotic Ahu, Skullbriar, Blight Palm, Velkospara, any deck that cares about counters being on your things. I think this is just almost an auto-include in that deck. It's also intriguing in dedicated landfall decks, especially if you got some synergies for it. Like Oban actually kind of cares about +1/+1 counters. It has the same trigger actually, where whenever land ETBs you put a counter on something. So Bristly Bill, really easy support there. Or like Phalith is a landfall deck, but it also cares about plants. Bristly Bill is a plant, so it works well there. So I think Bristly Bill, very good card. I expect this card should be able to see play in standard. I'm always a little skeptical when it comes to green cards, just because green has been so bad for the last year of standard. But looking at all the stuff on this card, all the text, all the abilities, this feels like it should be a standard playable card, and we already have archetypes that can support this card, so it feels like it should be a standard playable card. It's also just like a hilarious against the odds card, thanks to the counter doubling ability, where you can have some of these huge turns where you're just going to make the most ridiculously big creature of all time, plus really sweet encounters or landfall commander decks. Next up, we got a new Izzet Grizzly Bears in Malcolm the Eyes. So Malcolm the Eyes, 2-mana 2/2 Flying Haste, legendary Siren Pirate, and when you cast your second spell each turn, investigate. So Malcolm seems like a good aggro card. 2-mana 2/2 Flying Haste, a good starting point if you're trying to be aggressive, hitting in for fast damage in the air. Seems like it could work in some sort of Spell Slinger deck. I think it's worse than Slick Show Off in this deck, but you probably would just play both of them. Curious to try Izzet Spell Slinger, because you're casting a bunch of spells to like trigger prowess on your stuff or trigger Slick Show Off. That's also going to make clues, which helps you recover in the late game if things go wrong. But I think the most obvious home for this card, definitely going to be Pirates. In Pirates, Malcolm is the perfect 2-drop. It fills out the curve, it gets in damage, Pirates want to be aggro, plus Pirates can take advantage of the clue token in a way that a lot of other decks can't. So in an aggro deck, finding time to crack your clue can sometimes be an issue, but in Pirates, they just want artifacts on the battlefield to trigger their stuff, to support their stuff. So I think this makes like Breaches and Staunch Crewmate a lot better. Pirates is one of those decks that's really close to being good. I've played it a bit, I've seen other people play it. It's not far off, and I think that a card like Malcolm might be that little push it needs to be playable. So another really solid Grizzly Bears. We also got probably the best Grizzly Bear of the day in Seraphic Steed. So a Selesnya Grizzly Bear, 2-mana 2/2 Unicorn Mount, has first strike and lifelink. When it attacks while saddled, you make a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying, and you can saddle it for 4. So this card is kind of ridiculous. When you think about 2024 Magic, you really want threats that can snowball into a victory, and I think that Seraphic Steed is exactly one of those cards. If you play this on turn 2, and then on turn 3, you drop a 4 power 3 drop, which there are plenty of if you want to try to pull off this strategy, you can just attack with the Seraphic Steed, saddle it up, make a 3/3 flyer, and use that to snowball into victory. If you're on the plane specific, there's a decent chance that because of first strike, you're going to be able to get an attack and not lose your Seraphic Steed when you do this. So when you have this card on turn 2 into a 4-power 3-drop, and this makes an Angel on turn 3, you're just going to run away with the game. That is a really, really ridiculously fast start. So I already love that aspect of the card. Plus, the baseline isn't that bad. If you've been around for a while, you might remember Knight of Meadowgrain, which was a legit standard staple back in its day. This is a 2-mana 2/2 first strike lifelink. So we already got a good baseline, even without this snowballing into victory, making Angels, saddling things up plan. So as far as where to play this card, it works really well with Vraska joins up. We've seen on Gliss's Sunslayer, the combo of First Strike and Death Touch is ridiculously strong in combat. So I'm very intrigued to try to like play Seraphic Steed, give it Death Touch, and then just like snowball that Angel ability while saddling it up every turn. So that seems like one possibility. Also just seems good in life gain. Like it is a life linking creature. We've seen some life gain decks around the fringes of the format, right? Lunarch Veterans, Voice of the Blessed, Amalia. So Seraphic Steed could fit in some sort of like Abzan life gain style deck as well, be really good there. So I think this card is just really strong. Like, if you're willing to build around this and its saddle ability, I think this is one of those 2-drops that its floor is strong. It's a Knight of Meadowgrain, which is already a good floor on the card, and then the ceiling is 2024, my 2-drop snowballs into a victory by making these fires starting on turn 3. So I think this card is going to see a lot of play. Also notable, not legendary. All of our other Grizzly Bears, I believe, have been legendary. This one you can just stack up a bunch on the battlefield. So Seraphic Steed, for standard and specific, I think is just like the best saddle card we've seen so far and the best of our Grizzly Bears for today. The only downside is it isn't green, and green isn't the best color, but outside of that, I feel like this card should see a lot of play. As far as reprints, we get one really big one today in Terror of the Peaks. So Terror of the Peaks, originally from Core Set 2021, so not really even that old, but this card's already up to $40. So just from a value perspective, really good reprint. Also a pretty good card gameplay-wise. Is a 5-mana 5/4 flyer that essentially has ward, pay 3 life, and when another creature ETB is under your control, deals its damage to any target. So Terror of the Peak, most commonly played as a combo piece. Like this is one of the finishers in like Dragonstorm combo in Historic, where you loop your Blade Wings and you got Terror of the Peaks and just snipe your opponent out of the game with burn damage. So that's kind of the main way to play the card. I could see this being like a reanimation combo piece in standard. We do have Bringer of the Last Gifts. One of the easiest ways to like kill someone with Terror of the Peaks is just have it come into play along with a ton of other creatures. So if you just fill your graveyard and then Bringer of the Last Gifts, reanimate, tear a bunch of other stuff, they'll all trigger Terror. You'll burn your opponent out of the game right away. Plus, we have a lot of dragon synergies in standard. We got Sarkhan and Rivaz, 2 3-drops that can ramp into it early, plus Bono Dracosaur, Zoro Ojitai, Junji. There's a lot of good dragons in the format, so maybe we see dragons take off because of Terror of the Peaks. But most importantly, this is just a solid commander reprint. Terror of the Peaks is a card that people want to play in a lot of different dragon decks. If you're Lathlis or Ur-Dragon or Miram, it's just a really strong dragon in your deck. It works as a removal, it works as a finisher, it's on curve. The problem is, at $40, it's really hard to justify spending that on just like another good dragon for my deck. But now, because of this reprinting, I would guess that Terror of the Peaks drops down probably under $10, which means if you've been wanting to add one of these to your Commander Dragon deck, this is going to be the perfect time to pick it up. The only downside of this reprint is there's no cowboy hat. So how do I even know what set it's from, Watsy? I was very confused when I saw that. I was like, a Terror of the Peaks, that's cool, but why are they spoiling this? What set are they spoiling this from? So I probably should have had a cowboy hat, but discounting no cowboy hat. Very good reprint. I'm never going to complain when Watsy reprints a $40 card. It makes the game more accessible for people, and that's what we want. Finally today, couple of low rarity cards. The only one I really want to mention individually is Shoot the Sheriff. So Shoot the Sheriff, but not the deputy, of course. 2-mana instant, destroy target non-outlaw creature. So assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, warlocks are excluded, kills everything else. This card is almost go for the throat currently. If you look at the most played creatures in the format, Shoot the Sheriff kills 46 of the 50 most played right now. Go for the throat, I think, is like 48 or something. So it kills almost everything. However, it's going to get worse because we're getting a bunch of outlaw creature types in Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the set's super pushed. So short term, it's worse Go for the Throw. So I think Go for the Throw is still the staple 2-mana removal spell, although this card certainly has uses, and it could be a sneaky option in older formats where assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, warlocks don't see a ton of play. So if you're looking for a Go for the Throw in like Pioneer, I'd have to do all the math on Pioneer and look through all the creature types, but there's a chance that Shoot the Sheriff actually just kills more of the important things in Go for the Throw. So a solid removal spell that is going to serve a purpose, but is probably just worse than Go for the Throw over the short term. Otherwise, there are a ton of commons and uncommons to look through. You can find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers for today. And I gotta say, we're 3 days into this spoiler season, and this set is absurd. This set's almost giving me Eldraine vibes. Is just like, it's so strong. It is so strong. So many of these cards seem so playable, so good. So this just seems to me like one of the strongest sets we've seen in Standard in a long time, which I guess after Murders at Karlov Manor kind of being powered down is kind of exciting, right? There's actually so many cards that not only seem to have potential for Standard, but there's a lot of cards for Pioneer and Modern and Timeless and Historic and all these other formats as well. And of course, Commander, where everything's good in Commander these days. So let me know what you think. What are you most hyped for? What's your favorite card of the day? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers. Until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's spoiler video right here, or maybe check out last night's Against the Odds, where I exploded Yargle's corpse on a ill-tempered loner.